They were beings of colossal proportions that walked the earth before history began to be written. The Bible that the world knows mentions them in just 4 brief verses and then remains silent forever. But there is another Bible, kept in the mountains of Africa, that describes them with a detail that defies all reason. That version of the sacred scriptures speaks of their names, their crimes, and the final fate of each one of them. What you are about to discover contradicts everything you were ever taught about the official biblical canon of the world. Only one church in the entire world preserved these texts, while the rest of humanity chose to burn them mercilessly. The question that no one in the West wants to answer is why only Ethiopia managed to preserve this ancient secret. There is a very specific reason why these sacred books were declared heretical during the 4th Christian century. And that reason has everything to do with what they reveal about the beings that lived and dominated before the great universal flood. The Book of Enoch, preserved in Gez, describes a world that official history prefers to deny completely. While Rome decided which truths the Christian people could know, the mountains of Ethiopia kept a deep silence. But that silence was not ignorance, but the deliberate guardianship of a heritage too sacred to ever be destroyed. Today, those texts are being studied with an unprecedented scientific urgency in modern history. What they contain could definitively transform our understanding of humanity's most distant past. Let's start from the beginning, from the moment when 2 traditions of the same sacred text took different paths. In the year 325 AD, the Council of Nicaea brought together the top leaders of the Christian Church from around the world. 318 bishops debated for long weeks which ancient texts deserved to be part of the sacred canon. The criterion was not only theological, but also political, and that would forever change the history of sacred knowledge. Certain books were excluded because their content was deemed too disturbing for the Roman ecclesiastical institution. Among them was the Book of Enoch, which detailed the rebellion of the fallen angels and their monstrous offspring. But in the kingdom of Axum, in what is today Ethiopia, that conciliatory decision was never fully accepted or adhered to. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church maintained a canon of 81 books, 15 more than the standard Protestant Bible. Among those additional books were the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and several other equally sacred texts. These texts were not excluded by oversight, but because the Ethiopian tradition considered them authentic. The legitimate question is, who was right, the European councils or the priests of Tigray, Ethiopia? To answer it, one must understand what the Book of Enoch exactly says about the Nephilim and the Watchers. The text opens with a statement that would shake the foundations of any theology seminar in the contemporary world. Describe how 200 angelic beings descended upon Mount Hermon with a forbidden purpose. Their names are recorded one by one in the text: Semyaza, Azazel, Armaros, Barakel, Kokabel, and dozens of other beings. These beings, called Watchers or egregores in the apocryphal tradition, took human wives violating the law of the Most High. The union between the celestial and the earthly produced creatures that did not fit into any known category. The Book of Enoch describes the Nephilim as giants of superhuman stature according to the ancient measure used. Modern scholars interpret that figure as a symbol of enormity rather than an exact, literal measurement. The most disturbing thing was not its size, but its behavior, described with systematic and cold cruelty. The Nephilim first consumed the resources of men and then began to devour them without remorse. But the Ethiopian text is not limited to physical horrors. It also describes a deep intellectual corruption. Azazel taught men to make swords, shields, and bronze armor with destructive precision. He revealed to them the art of adorning the body with metals and jewels, introducing vanity as a tool of evil. Other watchers taught enchantments, astrology, and the knowledge of plants for the purpose of domination. However, that knowledge was not given as a gift, but as a tool of control over men. The earth was filled with blood and injustice until the Most High decided that intervention was inevitable. Then he ordered 4 archangels to act. Michael, Sariel, Raphael, and Gabriel received clear missions. Raphael had to chain Azazel, throw him into a pit in the desert, and cover him with rocks until the final judgment. Gabriel was ordered to incite the Nephilim to war against each other so that they would perish by their own hand. Miguel had to chain Semyaza and the other watchers under the hills for 70 complete generations. This account does not exist in the standard Western Bible, but it is a central part of ancient Ethiopian theology. The question is how this text arrived in Ethiopia and how it managed to survive while the rest of the world rejected it. The answer begins in the 4th century before Christ, when Jews settled near Lake Tana. These Jews, known as the Beta Israel or Falasha, brought texts that would later be excluded from rabbinism. Among those texts was the Book of Enoch, considered in ancient Jewish tradition a writing of genuine faith. When Christianity arrived in Ethiopia in the 4th century, it already found a textual foundation that included those works. King Ezana of Aksum embraced Christianity in the year 330, becoming the first Christian monarch in Africa. But unlike Constantine in Rome, Ezana did not need to rewrite the textual tradition from absolute scratch. The Ethiopian Church absorbed these texts as its own and integrated them into its liturgy and overall worldview. Meanwhile, in Europe, the Book of Enoch was hunted down, burned, and declared a work of unscrupulous forgers. St. Augustine rejected it for being too ancient to verify, and his authority sealed its fate there. In Ethiopia, the monks of Debre Damo and Lalibela copied the text with reverence from generation to generation. The rock-hewn churches of Lalibela are a testament to a faith that sought no approval from the outside. In those sacred spaces, the priests recited passages from the Book of Enoch as part of their daily liturgy. The text was not an esoteric secret for initiates, but rather part of the basic training for every Ethiopian Christian. This explains why when James Bruce returned from Ethiopia in 1773, the academic Europe was bewildered. Bruce brought 3 copies of the Book of Enoch in Ge'ez and presented the finding as a treasure of immeasurable value. The reaction was one of absolute skepticism. Many believed it was a medieval forgery with no basis. When Richard Lawrence translated it into English in 1821, scholars began to recognize something they had lost. The text was coherent, ancient, and presented a cosmology that correlated with real archaeological findings. In 1947, the Dead Sea Scrolls confirmed that the Book of Enoch was known in Palestine before Christ. Fragments in Aramaic found in Qumran demonstrated that it was not a medieval Ethiopian invention, but something earlier. This changed everything. The text that Europe had rejected turned out to be one of the oldest known Jewish writings. However, the scrolls only confirmed fragments, while the Ethiopian version in Ge'ez is the only complete copy. This makes Ethiopia the irreplaceable custodian of a textual heritage of all humanity without exception. But let's return to the content of the text, because what it describes about the Nephilim goes far beyond violence. The Ethiopian Book of Enoch describes the spiritual architecture of the cosmos with a unique precision in written history. It speaks of the seven heavens, of the angels who control natural phenomena, of the chambers of the righteous souls. Describe the place where the spirits of the dead Nephilim wandered as bodiless entities in the underworld. This is, according to many theologians, the first textual explanation of the origin of demons in the Abrahamic tradition. The spirits of the giants, stripped of their bodies and unable to reach the spiritual realm, wandered aimlessly. Condemned between worlds, those spirits began to torment living human beings with evils and temptations. This theology explains something that the Standard Bible never answers. Where exactly evil spirits come from? Without the narrative of the Book of Enoch, Christian demonology is left orphaned of its most coherent origin explanation. But there is something more that the Ethiopian text describes, which is even more difficult to integrate into Western theology. The Book of Enoch not only speaks of giants, but also of a complete cosmic system that was deliberately hidden. This system described angelic hierarchies, celestial laws, and consequences for those who violated them with pride. The Watchers were not lesser angels or impulsive creatures, but high-ranking beings who chose rebellion. Their decision to descend to earth was made in a collective assembly, like a pact sealed on Mount Hermon. The text describes that moment with a solemnity that indicates its authors believed they were recording a real historical fact. The Book of Enoch speaks of Enoch himself as a mediator who intercedes before the Most High on behalf of the fallen Watchers. Enoch ascends to the heavens, contemplates divine glory, and receives revelations that he later conveys to his son Methuselah. This Enoch is the same one that the Standard Bible simply says, walked with God, and one day disappeared without a trace. 7 verses, that is all that Genesis dedicates to one of the great prophets of ancient sacred literature. In contrast, the Ethiopian Book of Enoch dedicates 108 chapters to astronomical and eschatological revelations. The difference between both traditions cannot be explained by editorial preferences or merely stylistic criteria. Something more fundamental occurred in the councils of the 4th century, a decision of power that shaped centuries of spirituality. The councils of Nicaea, Laodicea, and Carthage not only defined the truth, but also what kind of believer was desired. A believer without knowledge of the Watchers and the Nephilim was an easier believer to guide institutionally. However, in Ethiopia, this never happened because the church there did not remain under the authority of Rome or Constantinople. The Tawahedo Church maintained its doctrinal independence, and with it preserved an older and more complex worldview. This independence has geographical roots. The Ethiopian mountains created an isolation that protected their faith from the outside. But the Ethiopian Church also has theological roots. It rejected the Council of Chalcedon in 451 and followed its own path. That separation from the rest of official Christianity was what allowed the survival of invaluable texts for everyone. The monks of the Debre Libanos monastery, founded in the 13th century, copied the Book of Enoch without interruption. In the monastery of Dabra Bizan, 14th century manuscripts in Ge'ez preserved versions that no one else had seen. Each scroll was copied with a ritual meticulousness that reflected the conviction of conveying a true divine message. While Europe was burning texts during the Inquisition, Ethiopia was binding them in leather and storing them in its churches. This difference in attitude towards sacred knowledge reflects two distinct views of the relationship between faith and written text. For the dominant Western tradition, the canon was a wall that protected orthodoxy from external contaminations. For the Ethiopian Church, this narrative was neither metaphor nor allegory, but a sacred history that had to be preserved. This conviction explains why the inclusion of the text in the canon was never questioned, even under external pressure. Generation after generation, Ethiopian priests passed on this knowledge as if faith depended on it. And, in a way, it was so. Because, without this account, many passages of the Standard Bible become incomprehensible. The New Testament makes references to fallen angels and their prison that make sense with the Book of Enoch. For Ethiopian tradition, the canon was a garden that could host more flowers than the European eye would accept. There is a dimension of the Book of Enoch that we have not yet explored and that connects with current scientific debates. The text describes the transmission of forbidden knowledge from the Watchers to the oldest human beings. Metallurgy, astronomy, medicine, and enchantments were taught by non-human entities to an unprepared humanity. This narrative sparked a debate among historians of science about the true origin of the first civilizations. Some researchers point out that the technological leap of the Neolithic period was too rapid to be explained alone. They do not claim that the Watchers were extraterrestrials, but rather that the text reflects the memory of a civilizational trauma. Whatever the interpretation, the Ethiopian Bible preserved this narrative while the Western world chose to suppress it. And that suppression had concrete consequences on how humanity interpreted its past for a whole 15 centuries. Without the Book of Enoch, Genesis seems to indicate that evil arose solely from the human weakness embodied in Adam and Eve. With the Book of Enoch, a more complex picture emerges, where corruption also came from entities that rebelled. This theological difference is crucial because it changes the nature of moral responsibility in the Abrahamic tradition. If the Nephilim actively introduced evil, then humanity was also a victim and not just the author of its ills. This perspective generates empathy towards the human condition and adds a cosmic complexity that the standard canon avoids. It is not difficult to understand why the councils of the 4th century preferred a simpler and more controllable narrative. However, millions of Ethiopian Christians never had access to that simplified version due to their long-standing tradition. For them, Enoch is not a marginal character of 7 verses, but the first prophet and mediator between worlds. This difference in perspective explains why Ethiopian spirituality has such a surprising symbolic density. The Ethiopian crosses, the icons, and the liturgy in Jez reflect a universe where the visible and the invisible engage in dialogue. Ethiopian priests know the names of the archangels from the Book of Enoch and invoke them in their daily prayers. They know the hierarchy of celestial beings described in the text and incorporate it into a living cosmology to this day. This continuity between ancient text and current religious practice is what makes the Ethiopian case unique in the world. The Ethiopian tradition of the Nephilim continues beyond Enoch, as other texts further elaborate on the narrative. The Book of Jubilees, also preserved complete only in GEs, provides a detailed chronology of the Watchers. Describe how the Most High allowed some Nephilim spirits to remain on earth to torment the wicked. This negotiation between the leader of the evil spirits and the Most High has direct echoes in the biblical Book of Job. Without the Book of Jubilees, the connection between Satan and the spirits of the Nephilim is difficult to trace in the text. So the Ethiopian Bible not only preserves additional books, but also the context to better understand the standard canon. It's like having the complete draft of a work when the rest of the world only knows the edited version for the public. And this leads to a question that scholars have begun to ask with increasing seriousness in recent decades. The letter of Jude and the second epistle of Peter directly refer to this text as if their readers were well acquainted with it. This suggests that in the early centuries of Christianity, the Book of Enoch was widely read and respected. It was only with the consolidated Roman ecclesiastical power that it began to be marginalized and declared an apocryphal text. The Ethiopian tradition resisted that marginalization because it never recognized the authority of Rome over its own canon. And that silent resistance, practiced in stone monasteries, preserved what the world had almost lost forever. Was the exclusion of the Book of Enoch a purely theological decision, or did it have deeper political motivations? The honest answer is that it was probably both, because in the 4th century theology and politics were one and the same. Constantine needed a unified church for a fractured empire, and that required a single common sacred text. Any text that generated disputes about the nature of angels or the Nephilim was a real political obstacle. The Book of Enoch generated constant disputes due to its cosmology being too complex to be managed institutionally. However, in Ethiopia, there was no Constantine who needed to standardize the sacred text to consolidate power. The Tawahedo Church could afford textual wealth because its political context did not rely on uniformity. This institutional freedom was the historical accident that saved the Book of Enoch and the memory of the Nephilim for everyone. Today, universities in Addis Ababa, Oxford, and Harvard have joint projects to digitize manuscripts in Ge'ez. Hundreds of texts never read by modern eyes are being catalogued in hard-to-access monasteries even today. Some scholars speculate that among those manuscripts there could be variants of the Book of Enoch with additional data. This possibility keeps the academic community in an expectation that is rarely seen in global biblical theology. Because if there are more texts that expand on the story of the Nephilim, everything we think we know could change again. The Ethiopian Bible is not simply an alternative version of a known text. It is an almost lost window into the world. A window that preserved, with extraordinary fidelity, the oldest memories of the human relationship with the divine. The Nephilim in this tradition are not monsters from an ancient story designed to explain the origin of cosmic evil. They are the testimony of a moment when the boundaries between the human and the non-human became dangerously blurred. And the decision to remember that moment, to not erase it from the scriptures, to always copy it, was profoundly human. A decision made by anonymous monks in stone monasteries, convinced that the truth had to be preserved this way. Without those monks, that tradition, and that church resistant to outside councils, something important would have been lost. We would have lost the most complete version of the account of what happened when the celestial order chose to disobey. But thanks to Ethiopia and the canon of 81 books, that account has survived intact to the present we live in. Today, more people than ever are reading the Book of Enoch for the first time, with genuine astonishment and real questions. They ask questions that their grandparents could never formulate because the texts that generated them did not exist for them. Questions are raised about angels, the origin of evil, and what happened in the centuries leading up to the Great Flood. These are questions that the standard Bible cannot answer because someone decided 16 centuries ago that they should not be asked. But Ethiopia kept the answers without asking for permission and without waiting for the West to validate its own millennial tradition. The next time someone says that the Bible says such a thing about the giants, remember that there is another Bible as well. The texts in Ge'ez are now studied with linguistic tools that allow for precise dating of their antiquity. The analyses indicate that the Ethiopian version is based on older originals than any European manuscript. This confirms that Ethiopia did not invent these texts, but preserved them with exceptional and persistent fidelity, and that collective and anonymous fidelity is perhaps the greatest spiritual legacy that Ethiopia has given to all of humanity. It is a Bible of 81 books, written in Ge'ez, read by Ethiopian priests for over 2,000 years. That Bible speaks of the Nephilim with a depth and precision that no sacred text from the West has ever matched. And the fact that it exists, that it has survived, is in itself one of the great mysteries of religious history. Because the texts that power wants to destroy often find a way to survive in the most unexpected places. The Book of Enoch survived because someone believed it was worth risking their life to copy it once more, forever. And that act of anonymous faith is what today allows us to contemplate the most disturbing history excluded from the official Bible. The truth about the Nephilim did not disappear. It waited silently in the mountains of Ethiopia until the world sought it. If this mystery left you with more questions than answers, subscribe now, because the most disturbing is yet to come.